In the frozen wasteland of Svalbard, where temperatures plummet to 40 below zero and the sun disappears for months at a time, legends are not born from strength alone. They are forged in the crucible of desperation, carved from the ice by necessity, and tempered in the brutal fires of survival. This is the story of Nanook, a polar bear cub whose name would one day echo across the Arctic tundra like thunder rolling over glaciers. But legends do not begin with victory. They begin with weakness, with failure, and with a kind of helplessness that breaks the spirit before it can ever learn to soar. The Arctic Ocean stretched endlessly before them, a maze of shifting ice floes and deadly black water that could swallow a bear whole in seconds. Nanook pressed close to his mother, COUB's massive frame, her fur still carrying the scent of milk and warmth that had sustained him through his first winter. At 8 months old, he should have been learning to hunt, to read the ice, to understand the ancient rhythms that governed life at the top of the world. Instead, he stumbled through the snow like a lost shadow, his paws too clumsy, his instincts too dull, his courage buried beneath layers of doubt. COUB watched her son with growing concern. Other cubs his age were already attempting their first seal hunts, mimicking their mothers with the fierce determination that would one day make them apex predators. But Nanook flinched at the sight of breathing holes, cowered when walruses bellowed in the distance, and seemed more interested in playing with chunks of ice than learning to break through them. The harsh reality of the Arctic showed no mercy to the weak, and winter was approaching fast. The first sign of trouble came on a morning when the aurora borealis still painted the sky in sheets of green fire. COUB had located a breathing hole where a ringed seal surfaced regularly to gulp precious air. She positioned herself downwind, her massive body perfectly still, her black nose barely inches from the opening. This was the lesson Nanook needed to learn: the art of the wait, the patience of the predator, the moment when stillness becomes violence. Hours passed. The wind carved patterns in the snow around them, and Nanook's legs trembled from the cold and the effort of remaining motionless. His mother's breathing was so controlled, it seemed she had become part of the ice itself. Then the water rippled. A dark shape moved beneath the surface. COUB's muscles coiled like loaded springs, every fiber of her 800-pound frame ready to explode into motion. The seal's whiskered face broke the surface. COUB struck with lightning precision, her massive paw crashing down where the seal's head should have been. But the ice around the hole crumbled under her weight, and the seal vanished into the depths with barely a splash. Nanook had shifted his weight at the crucial moment, sending vibrations through the ice that warned their prey. His mother's eyes met his, and in them he saw not anger, but something far worse: disappointment. That night, as the wind howled across the barren landscape and temperatures dropped to levels that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, COUB shared what little fat reserves she had left with her son. Nanook could feel her ribs beneath her thick fur, could see the way her once powerful frame had begun to diminish. The failed hunt meant another day without food, another step closer to the starvation that claimed so many polar bears when the ice grew thin and prey grew scarce. The lessons continued, But Nanook's failures mounted like drifting snow. He spooked a bearded seal basking on an ice floe by approaching too quickly. He fell through thin ice while trying to reach a breathing hole, soaking his fur and nearly drowning before Siku hauled him to safety. Worst of all, he froze in terror when they encountered a lone male bear near their territory, forcing his mother to drive off a potential threat while he cowered behind a ridge of packed snow. Other cubs in the region were already showing promise. Nanook had seen them from a distance, their movements growing more confident with each passing day. They stalked imaginary prey with the focused intensity of natural-born hunters, their mothers nodding approval as they demonstrated the skills that would keep them alive. But when Nanook tried to imitate their actions, his movements were awkward and uncertain, like a creature trying to remember instincts that had never fully awakened. The breaking point came during a particularly harsh storm that lasted 3 days. The wind shrieked across the ice with the fury of a living thing, carrying snow so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. Siku and Nanook huddled together in a makeshift den she had scraped from a snowbank, their body heat the only thing standing between them and the killing cold. Food was now a distant memory. Siku's milk had dried up weeks ago, and their last successful hunt had been a small Arctic fox that provided barely enough nutrition to sustain them for a day. As the storm raged outside their shelter, Nanook could feel his mother's breathing growing labored. Her once massive frame seemed to be shrinking in before his eyes, her strength ebbing away like warmth fleeing from exposed skin. The reality hit him like a physical blow. His mother was dying. His failures as a hunter were not just embarrassing setbacks. They were death sentences, written in the unforgiving language of the Arctic. When the storm finally passed, the world had been transformed. Ice that had seemed solid was now fractured and dangerous. Familiar landmarks had been erased by the wind, leaving behind an alien landscape of pressure ridges and treacherous gaps. The cold was so intense that their breath froze instantly, creating tiny crystals that tinkled like broken glass when they fell. Siku struggled to her feet, her movements slow and painful. She had not eaten in over a week, and the effort of keeping them both warm during the storm had drained what little energy she had left. But she pressed forward anyway, following scent trails that promised the possibility of prey. Nanook followed in her wake, his own stomach cramping with hunger, his mind clouded by the growing certainty that they would not survive much longer. They were tracking the scent of seals toward a cluster of breathing holes when disaster struck. The ice beneath their feet seemed solid, thick enough to support even Siku's considerable weight, but the storm had weakened it in ways that were invisible to the naked eye. Stress fractures ran like spider webs through the frozen surface, and the constant pressure of wind and tide had hollowed out cavities that made the seemingly sturdy platform as fragile as eggshell. Siku was the first to sense the danger. Her ears flattened against her skull, and she froze mid-step, her instincts screaming warnings that came a heartbeat too late. The ice exploded beneath them with a sound like gunfire, and suddenly, they were both plunging toward the black water that meant certain death in the Arctic. Siku's massive paw struck the edge of solid ice just as Nanook disappeared beneath the surface. The shock of the frigid water hit him like 1,000 knives, driving the air from his lungs and sending his body into immediate panic. The Arctic Ocean was a liquid grave that had claimed countless bears, and now it reached for him with fingers of ice that seemed to drag him deeper into its black embrace. Above him, filtered through the churning water, he could see the pale glow of his mother's form as she fought to pull herself from the deadly trap. But Siku's strength had been sapped by weeks of starvation. Her claws scraped against the ice edge, finding purchase for moments before her grip failed. She crashed back into the water with a splash that sent waves across Nanook's face. The cold was beyond brutal. It was a living thing that wrapped around their bodies and squeezed, threatening to stop their hearts before hypothermia could claim them. Nanook's legs kicked frantically, his instincts finally awakening as the prospect of death cleared away all hesitation and doubt. He surfaced beside his mother, gasping for air that burned his lungs like fire. Siku's eyes were wide with a terror he had never seen before. Not the calculated wariness of a predator, but the raw panic of a creature that knew death was seconds away. Her powerful swimming strokes were growing weaker with each passing moment, and ice crystals were already beginning to form in her fur. The water around them was so cold that it seemed to thicken, making every movement an enormous effort. Nanook's mind raced through everything his mother had tried to teach him, the lessons he had failed, the techniques he had bungled, the instincts he had ignored. But now, with their lives hanging by the thinnest of threads, something deep within him began to stir. It was not courage, not yet. It was something more primitive and powerful. The will to survive that had carried polar bears through millennia of Arctic winters and endless hunts across the ice. He spotted a section of ice that looked thicker than the rest, its surface scarred but unbroken. Without hesitation, Nanook swam toward it, his strokes growing stronger as adrenaline flooded his system. He hauled himself onto the edge, his claws finding purchase in the frozen surface, and immediately turned back for his mother. Siku was struggling now, her massive frame working against her as the cold sapped her coordination. Ice was forming around her muzzle, and her breathing had become labored and desperate. Nanook did something he had never done before. He roared, not the pitiful whimper of a frightened cub, but a sound that carried across the ice like thunder. It was a roar of defiance, of refusal to surrender, of a young bear who would not watch his mother die. The sound seemed to give Siku a final burst of energy. She kicked toward him with movements that were more instinct than conscious thought, her body responding to her son's call. Together, they hauled Siku from the water. Nanook's smaller frame provided just enough leverage to help her massive weight clear the ice edge, and they both collapsed onto the frozen surface, their fur already beginning to freeze in the Arctic wind. But they were alive, against all odds, against the hunger and the cold and the merciless indifference of the Arctic. They had survived. The aftermath of their near drowning marked a turning point that neither of them fully understood at the time. As they huddled together, sharing the body heat and trying to prevent their soaked fur from freezing solid, Siku felt something shift in her perception of her son. The roar that had pulled her from the edge of death had not come from a helpless cub. It had come from something deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. But their ordeal was far from over. Soaked fur in sub-zero temperatures was a death sentence unless they could find shelter immediately. The wind cut through their wet coats like razors, and ice crystals were forming so quickly that their movements became stiff and mechanical. Siku's legs shook with exhaustion and cold, and she struggled to maintain the pace they needed to reach safety. Nanook found himself taking the lead for the first time in his life. His eyes scanned the landscape, reading the ice formations and snow patterns with an intensity that surprised him. There, less than half a mile away, he spotted the dark opening of a cave carved into a pressure ridge. It was shelter, but reaching it would require crossing a field of broken ice that shifted and groaned with every gust of wind. The journey became a nightmare of careful steps and calculated risks. Each ice floe they crossed could be their last, and the gaps between them yawned like hungry mouths waiting to swallow them whole. Siku stumbled repeatedly, her massive frame now more liability than asset as her strength continued to ebb. Several times, Nanook had to guide her around weak spots that his younger eyes detected, but her experience clouded vision missed. When they finally reached the cave, both bears collapsed immediately. The shelter was crude, barely large enough for Siku's massive form, but it blocked the wind and provided the insulation they desperately needed. They pressed together, their combined body heat slowly beginning to thaw the ice that had formed in their fur. For hours they lay motionless, too exhausted to do anything but breathe and try to recover from their brush with death. As dawn broke over the Arctic landscape, painting the ice in shades of golden pink that seemed impossible in such a harsh environment, Nanook felt something fundamental had changed within him. The terror of nearly losing his mother, the desperate fight for survival, had awakened instincts that had been dormant since his birth. He was no longer the clumsy cub who spooked seals and stumbled through the snow. Something harder and more determined had taken root in his spirit. But their trials were only beginning. Siku's condition had worsened dramatically. The combination of starvation, exhaustion, and the trauma of their near drowning had pushed her body beyond its limits. She could barely stand, and when she did manage to rise, her movements were painful and labored. The powerful predator who had once dominated the ice now struggled to walk in a straight line. Nanook watched his mother decline with a growing understanding of what it meant. If Siku could not hunt, they would both die. The Arctic showed no mercy to the weak or the injured, and winter was approaching with its promise of even harsher conditions and scarcer prey. For the first time in his young life, Nanook understood that survival was not something that would be given to him. It was something he would have to take. The transformation had begun, but the real test lay ahead. Soon, the helpless cub would have to become the hunter, the protector, the provider. The ice field stretched endlessly before them, beautiful and terrible and completely indifferent to their fate. But somewhere in the depths of that frozen wilderness, a legend was beginning to stir. The morning after their escape from the icy waters brought a revelation that would reshape everything Nanook thought he understood about survival. Siku lay motionless in the cramped cave, her breathing shallow and labored, frost crystals forming around her nostrils with each painful exhale. When she attempted to rise, her left foreleg buckled beneath her massive weight, sending waves of agony through her battered frame. The fall through the ice had torn something deep within her shoulder, muscles and tendons damaged beyond her body's ability to heal quickly in their current state of starvation. Nanook circled his mother with growing alarm, whimpering softly as he nuzzled against her neck. For 8 months, Siku had been his entire world, his teacher, his protector, his source of warmth and food and safety. Now she could barely lift her head, and the terrible understanding crashed over him like another frigid wave. If his mother could not hunt, if she could not provide, then he would have to become something he had never been before. He would have to become the hunter. The first attempts were disasters that would have been comical if their lives had not hung in the balance. Nanook ventured from the cave with determination burning in his chest, only to return hours later, empty-pawed and shivering with cold. He spooked a young ringed seal by approaching the breathing hole from upwind, his scent carried on the Arctic breeze like a warning bell. He slipped on smooth ice while stalking a basking walrus pup, the sound of his tumbling body echoing across the floe and sending every creature within miles diving for safety. Each failure sent him back to his mother's side, where Siku would lift her great head with enormous effort and offer what guidance she could. Her voice was weak now, barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of generations of polar bear wisdom. She taught him to read the wind patterns, to understand how scent travels across the ice, to recognize the subtle signs that marked a seal's breathing hole from the countless other cracks and openings that dotted the frozen ocean. But knowledge without strength meant nothing in the Arctic, and Nanook's small frame seemed pitiful against the vastness of his task. Adult polar bears could weigh 800 pounds or more, their massive paws capable of crushing a seal's skull with a single blow. Nanook weighed perhaps 100 pounds soaking wet, his claws sharp but short, his muscles still developing. He was asking his body to do what evolution had designed for creatures 3 times his size. The breakthrough came during his 7th day of hunting attempts. Nanook had discovered a cluster of breathing holes near a pressure ridge where the ice had buckled and folded, creating natural blinds that could hide a stalking predator. He chose the smallest hole, reasoning that a young seal might use it, something closer to his own size, that he might actually be able to overpower. The wait stretched for hours, his legs cramped from maintaining the motionless crouch his mother had taught him. Snow began to fall, dusting his dark fur with white camouflage that made him nearly invisible against the ice. His stomach gnawed at itself with hunger, but he forced the pain aside, focusing every fiber of his being on the dark water below. When the seal finally surfaced, Nanook almost missed his chance from sheer surprise. The whiskered face broke the water just feet from his position, black eyes scanning for danger before the creature took its precious breath of air. For a heartbeat, predator and prey stared at each other across the gap between life and death. Then instinct exploded through Nanook's frame like lightning through a storm cloud. His paw crashed down with every ounce of strength his young body possessed. The impact sent shockwaves up his foreleg, but his claws found their mark, sinking deep into the seal's neck. The creature thrashed wildly, its flippers beating against the ice as it fought for freedom. But Nanook held on with desperate determination. This was not just a hunt. This was survival, pure and simple, stripped of all pretense and reduced to its most basic equation. The struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. When the seal finally went limp, Nanook found himself trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, hardly able to believe what he had accomplished. His first kill. His first step toward becoming the predator his species had always been. Blood stained the pristine ice around the breathing hole, and the metallic scent filled his nostrils with a mixture of triumph and primal satisfaction. Dragging his prize back to the cave proved almost as challenging as the hunt itself. The seal was nearly as large as Nanook, its dead weight awkward and unwieldy as he hauled it across the broken ice. Several times he had to stop and rest, his muscles screaming with fatigue. But the thought of his mother's condition drove him forward. When he finally reached their shelter, Siku's eyes widened with something that looked almost like disbelief. She fed first, as was proper, but her appetite was limited by her injuries and weakness. Most of the seal became Nanook's meal, the rich blubber and protein flooding his system with energy he had not felt in weeks. As he ate, tearing at the flesh with savage efficiency, he felt something fundamental shifting within his spirit. The helpless cub who had cowered behind his mother was dying, replaced by something harder and more capable. And so, beneath the endless Arctic sky, where legends are carved from ice and desperation, Nanook transformed from failure into myth. The cub who once cowered in shadows became the hunter who stalked through blizzards, the protector who stood against giants, the son who refused to let his mother fade into the white silence of the tundra. In the harshest classroom on Earth, where weakness means death and strength is the only currency that matters, a legend was forged not through birthright, but through blood, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her cub. The ice field of Svalbard still echo with his roar.